When Anita walked into the conference room with a thick stack of files and a calm demeanor, as if this were nothing more than a procedural step, Leslie assumed it was just another psychological tactic. But when the official DNA report was finally spread out across the table, each cold line of text confirming there was no biological connection between her and Barbara, something inside her felt violently torn away. It wasn't just the sense of losing her inheritance or being stripped of access to a vast fortune, but something deeper and darker, the feeling of being erased from history, of being written out of a family story she had always believed she belonged to. While Anita wielded sharp legal language to turn that sheet of paper into a weapon, all Leslie could hear was the pounding of her own heart, interlaced with the echo of flickering memories of Barbara, a woman who always kept her distance, yet in a few rare moments had allowed small touches, fleeting looks that Leslie once believed could only come from a mother suppressing her affection under too many constraints. Peaches was the first to break the silence by admitting what she had hidden for years. Barbara had once held Leslie in her arms like her own child, had whispered words only the two of them knew, had let cracks show in her icy exterior whenever Leslie was wounded by the brutal world of power around her. Peaches did not understand the terminology in the test results, but she trusted the memory of the body, the feel of those embraces, the times Barbara stood quietly watching Leslie sleep. For her, there was no way a single sheet of DNA results could erase everything her eyes had witnessed. Yet what tormented Leslie was not only Peaches' words, but the circumstances under which the DNA sample had been taken. Peaches had been lying in the intensive care unit, in a hospital where everything was beyond Leslie's control, from the stitches in a wound to the people able to move through restricted areas with a single swipe of a badge. Everything had happened too quickly, at too convenient a time, in a way that benefited Anita far too perfectly. The sense of being forced into a prearranged outcome turned Leslie's anger into something tangled with helplessness. Somewhere else in the hospital, Shanice was one of the few who still believed in the absolute value of protocol. As a nurse, she had witnessed her share of mistakes, but she had never accepted the idea that someone could deliberately bend medical records to serve a private agenda. She remembered precisely when she entered Peach's room, recalled each step, each confirming signature, each timestamp entered into the system. That was why, when she happened to review the medical records, she immediately noticed something off. The time of sample collection recorded in the file had been altered, and the hour in the system no longer matched the moment she had actually been there. At first, Shanice wanted to believe it was just a technical error or a data entry mistake. But the deeper she dug, the more she saw small cuts in the data, missing time windows, log entries that had disappeared as if someone had carefully cleaned up the trail. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she was forced to confront the most frightening possibility: someone had tampered with Peach's file, and if that was true, the DNA result Anita was using to attack Leslie might have been built on a chain of deliberate, calculated fraud. The dilemma began to tighten around Shanice like a vice. If she spoke up, she wouldn't just be accusing one individual, but challenging the entire hospital system, a place where people far more powerful than a dedicated nurse like her held sway. She knew very well that the hospital had received generous funding from various foundations, including the Barbara Trust, which lay firmly under Anita's influence. How could a complaint from a single nurse stand against the tangled interests of medicine, law, and finance? But if she stayed silent, Shanice would become complicit in erasing Leslie's identity, turning a living person into a stranger on the very ground she might have belonged to all along. She stared at the altered lines of data, her finger hovering over the print button, and understood that any choice she made would carry consequences she could not fully predict. In the dim light of her workspace, Shanice realized that the thin boundary between doing what was right and destroying her own life had never felt so fragile. Meanwhile, Leslie reverted to the instinctive response she knew best: strike back. She quickly assembled a formidable team of attorneys to prepare a lawsuit against Anita, to challenge the validity of the DNA result, and to examine the possibility of suing the hospital if any flaw could be found in the testing procedure. At first, the conflict seemed sharply defined between victim and aggressor, Leslie as the one stripped of inheritance and identity, Anita as the hand manipulating everything from behind the curtain. Yet things began to blur when Leslie happened to cross paths with one of the lawyers representing the Barbara Trust, a man who at first was nothing more than an adversary at the negotiating table, but gradually became a presence she could no longer ignore. He was not the kind of man Leslie was used to. There was no obsequiousness before wealth, no hungry glint at the mention of power, no visible thrill at sitting across from a woman who had grown up in the glittering world of the elite. On the contrary, he was sharp and so coldly rational he bordered on ruthless, relentlessly attacking Leslie with tightly constructed legal arguments that forced her to face the reality that every initial document was stacked against her. In his eyes, Leslie was not a tragic disinherited heiress, but a complicated case file, a playing piece on a negotiation board where each side tried to twist the law in its own favor. That blunt, unapologetic honesty and almost emotionless demeanor disturbed Leslie so deeply that she found herself haunted by it. In her world, men usually saw only the surface, the wealth, the Dupree name, or an opportunity to climb higher by taking advantage of her family's shadow. He, however, seemed interested only in the law's architecture, in the structure of the trust, in the binding clauses themselves rather than how many millions she might lose or how many pieces of her identity were being torn away. From those tense confrontations, an unnamed gray zone slowly formed between Leslie and that lawyer. She both hated and was drawn to him, because in him was something she lacked, the ability to stand outside emotion and read the core of a document, a contract, a scheme. He was both an unyielding opponent and a mirror reflecting back the darker corners of herself, the part Leslie had to admit might, at some point, have used the law as a weapon to push others into a corner, just as Anita was now doing to her. That unwilling attraction made Leslie's decisions increasingly uncertain. She was no longer sure whether she sought him out to attack him or to cling to him, to resist or to better understand what was truly happening in this war she had been dragged into. During all of this, Shanice could not sit idly by. She began quietly combing through the system logs, pushing past layers of security she technically had no right to touch. Each time she accessed restricted data, her heart sped up, because a single misstep could see her accused of exceeding her authority, even of illegal intrusion. Yet what she uncovered was even more terrifying. There had been an unauthorized access to Peach's file, occurring right around the time before the DNA results were issued. The account used did not belong to any staff member directly involved in Peach's care, it was a high-level administrative account capable of altering multiple records at once. It was as if someone had gone in, adjusted timestamps, and possibly tampered with laboratory data that were supposed to be strictly protected. Faced with increasingly clear evidence, Shanice knew she had few options left. If she went to hospital leadership, she risked exposing herself to the very people behind the interference. If she remained silent, she would live the rest of her life knowing she had personally helped erase a woman's identity. After many sleepless nights, Shanice decided to approach Leslie, hoping that the one at the eye of the storm would have enough drive and influence to help her overturn what had been done. Standing before Leslie, Shanice urged her to stop the impulsive legal assaults on the hospital and to give her time to cross-check, verify, and gather stronger proof. Shanice understood that if Leslie pushed everything into court while the evidence was still vague, the hospital would tighten its systems, and every trace could be wiped clean. But in Leslie's eyes at that moment, any call for patience could easily be misread as stalling, as complicity, as just another move in a larger game designed to drag things out until she lost the will to fight. Just as Shanice was trying to persuade Leslie, the lawyer from the trust unexpectedly began to send out ambiguous signals. He did not directly admit to any wrongdoing, but through his choice of questions and wording, Leslie started to sense that he too suspected the DNA sample had been manipulated by a third party. He referred to details that might have seemed marginal at first glance, the long-standing financial ties between the hospital and certain partners, the reappearance of old names in political circles once aligned with Vernon, figures whose influence could alter an investigation with a single phone call. Leslie realized that behind his cool professionalism, he was testing her reactions, trying to see how far she had gone, what she knew, whom she suspected. He moved like a man walking a thin line between his duty to protect his client's interests and a private urge to dig down to the truth, knowing that if the DNA truly had been switched, the entire legal machinery he had served would become nothing but an instrument of a filthy scheme. From that point on, the relationship between Leslie and the lawyer slipped fully into dangerous territory. They began to share with each other more fragments of information that should have belonged to two opposing camps. She told him about her unease at how quickly the DNA result had appeared, about the small oddities in the way Anita had prepared the documents, about Peach's insistence that she had seen Barbara hold Leslie like her own. He confided in her about invisible pressures forcing the case to be wrapped up neatly, about phone calls from parties not on the record whose words carried more weight than any official document. With every exchange, both of them edged closer to the line of betrayal. Leslie risked being seen as disloyal to her own legal team by feeding information to the other side, while he risked breaking his duty of confidentiality and loyalty to his client. The pull between them became increasingly distorted, colored by complicity, as if they were two people trying to defend what they believed was right while simultaneously tearing up the moral stakes they had once sworn they would never touch. While Leslie was being drawn deeper into that ambiguous bond, Anita refused to remain still. She quickly sensed the wavering on the trust side, the late-night closed-door meetings, the unusual audit reports that seemed designed to pave the way for a polished, digestible narrative. Anita increased the pressure on the hospital, subtly reminding them of the donations, joint projects, and funding agreements that might be reconsidered if the lawsuit wasn't handled properly. In the shadows of power's corridors, a tacit deal began to form. As long as the hospital continued to defend the validity of the DNA result, the trust would keep the money flowing. In return, those who had altered the records would be discreetly protected. From where she stood, Anita seemed to have no need to touch the data directly. She merely had to steer the people holding the keys to the system. And so more questions emerged. If the DNA had been swapped, how had Anita obtained a fake result so quickly? Which doctor or hospital administrator was bold enough to help her, or was there an even larger force behind her, a network already accustomed to cleaning records for sensitive deals? Shanice increasingly felt the weight of an invisible pressure pressing down on her. After she began digging into the logs, she was suddenly reassigned to inconvenient shifts, burdened with unlisted tasks that ate up her free time. A few close colleagues quietly warned her, but did not dare say who they feared. Her direct supervisor, who had always acted friendly, abruptly turned cold, repeating the importance of following protocol in a tone that made Shanice realize someone had begun to suspect her. Anonymous messages surfaced, filled with vague references to Barbara's past, implying that Shanice was not just an outsider, hinting that her own file might be revisited if she insisted on playing hero. Had Shanice unknowingly been involved in a medical incident related to Barbara in the past, now making her the weakest link, easiest to target if she chose to speak out? The question made every step she took feel heavier. On the other side, the trust's lawyer was being torn between loyalty and a growing discomfort in his conscience. He had been hired to protect the legal structure surrounding Barbara's trust, to ensure that the decision to exclude Leslie from the inheritance list stood firm. But the more he understood the case, the more he realized he might be helping to cement the outcome of a data manipulation. He knew that a single wrong move, a misplaced message containing sensitive information, could be seen as a breach of professional duty and used to destroy his career. Yet if he continued to ignore the signs and defended the DNA result despite clear irregularities, he would be forced to live with the knowledge that he had buried someone's identity and handed more power to people who treated human existence as nothing but numbers in a spreadsheet. His feelings for Leslie, whether genuine or merely the result of standing too close to the fire, only made things more complicated, because every time he faced her, he had to ask himself, was he getting closer to extract information for his client, or was he allowing himself to break the wall of professionalism for a fragile belief in the truth? In that context, suspicions surrounding Barbara thickened. Had Barbara herself once requested a secret DNA test years ago, when no one was watching, to confirm something she could not speak aloud? If so, had the true result been altered back then, and what existed now was merely a repetition of a long-constructed forgery? Who had access to those old tests, and who had supplied Anita with the data she was now using as a weapon? Was Barbara a victim in a larger manipulation network, or had she once been a link in that chain, with her legacy now torn apart by the very allies who used to stand at her side? The deeper Leslie dug, the more she realized the truth about her biological mother was being drowned inside a much larger power struggle. DNA was no longer just a matter of bloodlines. It had become the front line of a network of medical record tampering, hospital bribery, and shady transactions carried out under the banner of Barbara's trust. In her fury, Leslie had to choose between continuing to hurl herself forward like a spear, accepting dangerous alliances, even trusting a lawyer who had once stood against her, or stepping back and allowing others to rewrite her life story in cold, impersonal documents. Shanice stood between two firing lines, every piece of information she held capable of either saving an identity or dragging her down into a system saturated with filthy secrets. the lawyer drifted further from his safe zone, moving into a space where the boundary between protecting his client and abetting wrongdoing faded like a chalk line washed away by rain. In the end, when all of them had been pulled into this vortex of suspicion and betrayal, there were still questions no one dared answer. If the DNA had been switched, who gave the order, and for what purpose beyond simply cutting Leslie out of the trust? Was Anita merely an executor or the architect of the entire scheme? Would Shanice have enough courage to expose the truth when her own past was being threatened with exposure? Were the lawyer's feelings for Leslie a vulnerability for other forces to exploit, or the only chance for someone inside the legal system to break the silence? And above all, in a war where every sheet of paper, every test result, every record could be bought and altered, did the truth about Leslie's real mother still hold any value beyond being just another bargaining chip in a larger power game, where the loser risked not only money, but their identity, their future, and the last fragile shard of faith they had in themselves? Thank you all for your loyal support in listening.